So we are in the beginning of Acts chapter 9 this week.
Last.
Yep, indeed. After many weeks in chapter 8. And so herein, again, this chapter kind of divides down into essentially we're going to do it basically over 3 or probably actually 4 weeks in the end. I'll subdivide one of them just for time's sake. So we'll be in this chapter for about the next month, roughly speaking. But herein, verses 1 through to 19. And so, 19a, the first half of 19, I suppose. And so, yes, so concerning the famous conversion of Saul. So, let me read to us, and then we'll pray and commence our study from there. Yep, chapter 9. Alrighty. So, the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went out on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were travelling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." And he said, "Here I am, Lord." The Lord said to him, "Rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands upon him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. But here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call upon your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine, to carry my name before the Gentiles and before kings and before the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias departed and entered the house. And laying his hands upon him, he said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me, so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. And he rose and was baptized, and taking food, he was strengthened. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read them, mark them, learn them, and inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, this particular portion, as I know many of you are aware, marks a pivotal advancement or turning point in the Acts of the Apostles. Most notably a transition from the Saul that we have briefly yet strongly encountered over previous chapters to now a very different direction, literally and figuratively. There's a number of things in here that kind of we'll exegete along the way. that will be related to things that we've seen before, things that we will encounter over the weeks and months as we advance through the Acts of the Apostles, and a number of things which kind of relate textually here in this particular passage. And so what we'll do is we'll begin in verse 1 and work our way through from there. So, verse 1. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Again, Luke here is touching upon that same kind of motif of wickedness or of evil, not just in Saul's actions, but in his heart, in his intentions. To breathe, empneon in the Greek, to literally to be sustained by almost, to breathe murder, to breathe threats. It's speaking to basically the desire for murder and for slaughter was essentially his life's breath. Is the kind of imagery being encapsulated here. And so still breathing, so obviously still and showing a continuation. This is not something new. He was there and present and was in essence in charge of the murder of Stephen, right? Who was, as we accounted for, right? Who was brutally beaten, torn, dragged through the streets and then stoned to death. Here again, Luke is highlighting the depth of this, right? And so still being animated and driven by the bloodlust of murder and the desire to annihilate the church. This is what he does. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters, verse 2, to the synagogues at Damascus. For what purpose? So that if he found any belonging to the way, and we'll cover that in a minute, men or women, he might bring them bound or captive, in other words, to Jerusalem. So what's he doing here? Again, we've established before that what we've been reading from Saul and what we've been reading from the concerted effort to capture and to kill the Christians in the first century was not just kind of a lackadaisical effort, right? We explained when it came up before in the earlier chapters concerning the murder of Stephen, the martyrdom of Stephen, that this was by logical necessity, as well as just the historical evidence, this was a concerted, deliberate, well-connected, well-funded, well-organised, and well-perpetrated intelligence operation, right? That required a sophisticated network of intelligence gathering, of spies, of assets, of reporting and communication back and forth, not just in Jerusalem, but also now, over the last two chapters, after the church having dispersed and having fled Jerusalem because of the intensity of the persecution. Now that network expanding out clearly to the rest of Judea and Samaria and beyond, right? That region, okay? That's why, again, you're not told here, but the logical implication, right, is he asked basically for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. It's what is that saying to us? He's asking for permission from the high priest, official letters, to then march on the synagogues at Damascus and to get granted permission from the high priest to basically conduct a search warrant. That's essentially what a search warrant is. It's basically, it's not quite like a letters of marque as you would have had back in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, which was permission to act upon the order of the crown. This is basically a search warrant, is the kind of idea, if we're trying to translate that into modern parlance, as to what's going on here. Express written permission so that when he comes up on the synagogues and the actual priests or the rabbis in that synagogue are like, well, but hold on, you can't just search all that. He has letters from the high priest giving express permission. They go, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, off you go. Now, what would have been involved in those kind of letters? Again, based on the way this kind of operation would be conducted, obviously the ability not just to search the synagogue, but more importantly, it would have been warrant to interrogate members of the synagogue, to interrogate people connected to the synagogue in any way, either congregants or those who sold and bought supplies to the synagogue, various other things, any different kind of tentacles that could be search, any kind of strings that could be proverbially pulled to gather more intelligence. Again, he wouldn't have been he's gone out of his way to ask permission to go to Damascus, so clearly he's received some intelligence about Christians in Damascus. This wouldn't have just been a random, hey, why don't we just go check Damascus for the sake of it, if that makes sense, right? He would have received intelligence that Christians had fled or had established a church in Damascus, which is what they clearly have, right? So as part of the dispersion or the diaspora that occurred previous chapter, there's now been a church established in Damascus, right? All these Christians gathered there and establishing a church in Damascus. He's clearly received intelligence of that, and so wants warrant from the high priest to conduct an operation in Damascus, right? Again, for the express purpose, and he says, right, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound or captive to Jerusalem, right? Serious stuff, very serious. This is warrant to conduct an operation to capture and extradite Christians back to Jerusalem. And you would presume that if there was any resistance, he'd probably have warrant to kill them on the spot. This is the first time we get reference, I'm pretty sure off memory, this is the first time we get reference to Christianity being referred to as the way, capital W, the chodos, the way, which is just the same kind of word that you get, say, for example, from John 14, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. One of the many names that Christians refer to themselves by. The disciples of Jesus, the disciples, followers of the way, literally and figuratively. Christians, which again is what we get that reference to in Antioch, particularly. And so that's where we get this first reference. Not the first time, we'll get it a number of times across where Christians are referred to as followers of the way or belonging to the way. But this is the first instance of that. And so this is Luke establishing for us here the context of his journey, of why he was traveling to Damascus. You're told all but a couple of verses later that he's with a group of other men, and by men those are other operatives, right? Those are warriors, armed men, who would have been rolling with him to conduct that operation. And so it's fascinating their response as well, which we cover on a couple of verses later. But anyway, this is his purpose. Yep.
What would have happened to the bound Christians when they arrived in Jerusalem? Kangaroo, what in reality would be a kangaroo court. The exact treatment, all you have to do is go back and look at the treatment of Stephen. That's it. A court, a priestly court of the Sanhedrin, of the Jewish High Council, that would have very much thought itself to be legitimate, whilst violating every single biblical principle of legitimacy known to man. And then either for sure 100% what would have happened, torture, without question, because you're not going to waste a valuable source of what's called human intelligence by just killing them immediately, when you can extract intelligence or information from that source, that you have captive. So they absolutely would have been tortured as protocol and then killed. They would have been...
Whether they gave up anything or not.
They would have been tortured to recant, no doubt.
Oh, that for sure, 100%.
Because then they could have been paraded around saying, "See, we've changed our minds."
Correct. Yeah. So that would have been, and that would kind of be a byproduct for certain. It would have kind of been not a second. When I say secondary, I don't mean necessarily secondary importance. I mean more secondary in terms of their immediate focus. It certainly would have been a secondary byproduct, absolutely, because again, keeping in mind that this intelligence operation is also kind of part and parcel with propaganda operation, right? We've seen in previous chapters the simultaneous propaganda operation that's been going on in Jerusalem, and now they're trying to extend this out beyond Jerusalem, but especially in Jerusalem, right? The trial of Stephen was where the intelligence operation, the propaganda operation kind of converged, if that makes sense, right? And that's why it was so publicly done. That's why he was publicly beaten and dragged through the streets and mauled, and etc. And so, yes, you're very much right. So that would have 100% happened as well. Yeah.
But there's a really interesting undercurrent here, because remember in the previous chapter, we're told that Gamaliel got up and said to the men,
if this is
Yeah.
from God, you will not.
Yeah, a couple of chapters ago, yeah.
Your actions will not stand. So the Sanhedrin were ostensibly convinced by that, and they let things be. But Saul took it upon himself.
Yeah, yeah.
You see.
Yeah, and you've yeah, exactly. I mean, you could try and I don't think it's tenable because I just don't think that's how the flow of the text is working. But the not the what you said, what I'm about to say. You could argue that it's kind of died down a bit because we haven't really seen anything in Acts chapter 7 about it, right? I mean, they've dispersed. We haven't heard anything else about active persecutions. I think it's a bit of a non sequitur. I don't think it's an inference that can be drawn because it's just the way that the text is shifting. Is that because it's accounting this thing doesn't mean that something else is not also going on at the same time. But yeah, I take your point. Yeah, is that yes, Gamaliel's words of wisdom there certainly they didn't go ignored completely. But yeah, I mean they still ended up killing Stephen. And there's no indication that like the high priest or that the Sanhedrin like begrudgingly gave Saul a warrant here. You know what I mean? They would have been probably rather giddy. Well, giddy and not, because again, the logical inference of the way that this text is written already in the first two verses tells you, or it logically demands, that he's not going to Damascus kind of just casting a wide net. He would have been going there because he would have received intelligence from assets in Damascus that a church has now started in Damascus, and he's now got enough intelligence to get a warrant to justify taking a strike force into Damascus. Yeah. Yeah, this is the level of stuff that we're dealing with. This is what they faced. Yeah. So let's continue on through verse 3. So verse 3. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Now, this interaction with Christ we're going to break down in kind of reasonably systematic form, so that we don't kind of have too much information in one pile. So on his way to Damascus, and again, if number of you still have those maps from the other week, you would see up coming out of Caesarea Philippi up in the northeast. Obviously, it doesn't extend to Damascus. It would just simply say road to Damascus off memory, or the highway to Damascus, whatever it ends up saying. So the Via Maris would be continuing out from Damascus. So the Via Maris, the way of the sea, right? It's a Latin phrase that ran all the way down to Memphis, Egypt. We explained the other week.
It's quite a long way, really, isn't it?
Very long way. Oh yeah, very long way. Very long way. It runs from Damascus to Memphis, Egypt. And so once it gets to Damascus, you then enter Damascus, and the other side of Damascus begins the King's Highway, which would be, you probably would still actually have on a map, going back a couple of chapters now to Stephen's speech, when he's referencing Abraham and the journey of Abraham. You would, I imagine, I may be wrong, I may be recalling incorrectly, but I think on that map,
Yes.
you would have the King's Highway running diagonally through from Hebron. From Hebron, I think from Chazaz up in Syria.
Oh.
If you follow the King's Highway, it would be like a red line, maybe.
Oh,
Haran, yeah, from Haran. Okay, it was from Haran, was it? Fair enough then. So yes, from Haran you have the road running down and should end up intersecting at Damascus. Yeah. So that's the King's Highway, as it was referred to, and was pretty much the main thoroughfare across the northern Mesopotamian deserts. So yeah, Damascus is a major thoroughfare. Obviously, it's a major city, and we will touch on that in a second when it comes up to this street which is mentioned. And so more. Yeah, the straight street. I'll explain why it was called that in a minute once we get to it. So anyway, yes, on his way to Damascus, and suddenly light from heaven shines around him. Hard to miss. Falls to the ground, as only as anyone would, and he hears a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? First interesting point is this. There's a big picture point of this whole interaction, which we'll get to once we've actually covered all the details, and we'll circle back to the kind of meta-narrative point. But on the specific details, the Saul, Saul, like the repetition of the personal name, is not by accident. You may not come immediately to mind, but it actually happens a number of times whenever God is speaking to someone. He says it to Abraham. When he communicates with Abraham, one time he says, Abraham, Abraham. Moses as well, another interaction with Moses, he said Moses, Moses. Samuel is another one, Samuel, Samuel. And there's others along that kind of way. Jesus does it a couple of times as well when speaking to people. Yes. Yeah, it's an emphasis. Yeah, exactly. So verily, or just truthfully, like I say to you in truth. We would say that truthfully. I say this with meaning, like that's how we would say it. Yeah. And so when it's coming to a personal name, it's kind of adding a emphasis of the personal, the intimate. Yeah. And so again, which is fascinating, because again, this is highly educated rabbi and Pharisee who is in command of what are by every definition death squads. Who's running a sophisticated capture and intelligence operation, an extradition operation, in some cases an assassination operation, etc. And here he is speaking to him with a level of personality and personal intimacy that he has spoken to the likes of Abraham with. That's fascinating, right? To be referred to or to be communicated in that same way as some of these other great figures of the past. And yet you look at the person to whom it's being said. Immediately, and there's obviously a lot of points that could be drawn from it, one of the more important or pressing ones, I suppose, is what we've been covering in the Sunday we've just had and the Sunday we will have, right? The mercy and the grace, right? To be referring to someone like this, who he just, in that very sentence, why are you persecuting me? Right? Which in itself is fascinating, right? Because you go, well, he's persecuting the Christians. And Christ is like very clearly saying here, to persecute the Christians is to persecute him. Okay? He is the head of the church. He is the king of the world. He is the ruler of the kings of the earth. He is the king that is set above kings. He is the one who's described as the proverbial head to the church that is the proverbial body, right? And in case anyone needs an anatomy lesson, a body without a head is dead, right?
Just on that though,
yeah,
it's very interesting. It's actually confusing because he was persecuted, he did suffer, and then he was glorified in victory. So why is the persecuting in the present tense?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly it is. Yeah, exactly. It's in the... let me actually check exactly what it would be. It would have to be, I'm imagining, I'm going back and looking at it now. I don't want to guess, I could, but I want to guess. Just going back into the Greek, one moment. Yeah, present, indicative, active. So it's in the active. Remember we explained voices, right? Active, middle, and passive voice. Active voice, something you're doing. Middle voice, something being something that you're doing to yourself. And then the passive voice, something being done to you. This is in the active voice, right? In the Greek. So it's something that's he's actively doing. It's also in the present tense. It's an indicative, meaning that it's indicating that, as the term said, it's indicating to a particular action. In this case, present tense, you are right, in the Greek. Person. Oh, sorry, diokes, to persecute, but in the active tense. Yeah, and so the interesting question comes with how that relates. What it speaks to is kind of what I was highlighting there. It speaks to the fact that the relationship between Christ and his church is not just merely an ethereal or abstract one, if that makes sense. It's not just simply, it's not, it is symbolic, but when we take the term symbolic, again, often when we think symbolic, we think like just a picture and not real. That's not what symbolism has always been something that's real and tangible, but a symbol as a term refers to something through which something else is tangibly referenced and understood and connected with. So is Christ literally just a head to a proverbial body? No. He is the head of the church, which is the body, and is referred to as the body in the New Testament, and that not just relational aspect, but also functional aspect is something that's not just merely just kind of a reference that in the abstract or in the ethereal sense, right? He genuinely and really is connected to his church through the Spirit, right, as part of the Godhead, but is genuinely and tangibly connected to the church. There is a union that occurs. Again, this is not something that should be like really foreign at all. It's the same. It's in essence the same kind of union that takes place between man and wife in marriage, right? Are they two different physical anatomical bodies? Yeah. Are they two different individual spirits? Yes. But we're clearly told that there is a union that takes place between those two through the covenant of marriage, right? Exact same thing going here, which is exactly why another reference is that of marriage between Christ and the church, right? There's a union that has occurred. Yeah, bride, right. But hold on, but there are males in the church, so how did... No, you're missing the point here, right? You're missing the point of how symbolism works. Yeah. And so that kind of opens up our understanding to why he is saying why are you persecuting me, present tense. Yeah.
I think theologically it's far deeper than we can understand. He feels for present-day Christians who are persecuted, say in Nigeria.
Yep.
He intercedes for them. That's biblical.
Correct.
Could we go so far as to say that he grieves for them?
Sure. Yeah. There's nothing. It's not without the scope. It's not beyond the scope. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Exactly. It's not. And again, it's why the biblical symbolism is used. That's like you wouldn't intercede for, you wouldn't grieve for, you wouldn't care about your own wife being persecuted. Like, in real life, like it's not. There's no real leap of faith that has to occur here in understanding what this symbolism means. It's also on the... Oh, you go. Yep.
And therefore it highlights in a very important sense that Christians have a personal relationship with the Lord and Saviour.
Yeah, exactly,
and vice versa. He has a personal relationship with us. Yeah,
correct, yes. And there is a personal... Yeah, the personal element, not just individually but corporately. So I know what you mean by personal. Personal as opposed to merely abstract, yes. There is a personal connection between Christian and God, individually and also more importantly corporately, that is a feature that is either overwhelmingly absent or in most cases entirely absent from basically from any other religion you would like to compare to, especially polytheistic ones. There is no tangential connection on that personalized level in a polytheistic system, almost by definition, if not by necessity. Which is ironic because in polytheistic systems you will have the reason them being polytheistic, often people sometimes, if they're not from a polytheistic context, don't understand that doesn't mean that they sit around worshipping or deifying every single deity. In fact, they often don't. That's why you have personal deities or clan deities, tribal deities, regional deities, etc., etc., etc. Things that are related at one different level. And so, if you went to, say, let's take a modern polytheistic society, like India, okay, Hinduism. The average Indian isn't sitting down and worshipping the entire pantheon of Hindu deities. They'd be there for an extremely long time because their ancestors are to one level or another deified and at least venerated at the minimum.
There are over 300 million Hindu gods, so you couldn't address them all.
Yeah, correct.
In a lifetime.
No, that's my point. And counting it is a bit more like 330 these days. But yes, I'm with you. And so you will have personal deities. That's usually only one. So what's ironic is they end up being relatively monotheistic in one sense, at least in terms of their not logically, but I mean pragmatically speaking, which is ironic. I think it more speaks to, and that's always been the case. Go back to your ancestors, the Greeks. It's no different, right? You would have the temple of Artemis in Ephesus.
They had 10 or 12.
Yeah, exactly. And they wouldn't actively be honouring the entire Olympiad or all of the Olympian gods in their relative lifetime. They would deal with the ones that would concern them. If they were farmers and fishermen, exactly. They would be specifically worshipping Poseidon, they'd be specifically worshipping Artemis, they'd be specifically worshipping also probably Apollo just as a general, because Apollo covered a lot of things. How close do they live to a river? That would determine a lot of things as well. Did they live on a mountain? Do they live in a valley? Do they live upon the plains? That would determine a bunch of, all kinds of things like this, right?
What job you did.
What job they did, everything else, right, 100%. And so how often were they seafaring? They'd want to make sure Poseidon was okay. All these kinds of things. And so they wouldn't be even honouring the entire Olympian gods, just as a generic thing of life. And so the personalised element is only really specifically pragmatically functional, not relational, absolutely not relational. Even the concept of being relational.
That's why it would have astounded Saul here, because suddenly it goes from the Jewish scriptural distant Yahweh to a thoroughly personal God who is addressing him in the sense that you mentioned earlier.
And in ways that he only ever would have read of occurring. You know what I mean?
It really would have shocked him.
Oh, yeah. Well, he falls to the ground. That's enough of an indication, yeah, exactly. And so that's what I mean by the personalised element. Because what you have in polytheistic contexts, or even other monotheistic contexts, like the rare ones like Islam, is that it's not so much personalised as it is individualised. That might seem like a kind of semantic nitpicking, but it's not really. The Hindu family that just honours, just going to pick any of them, right? Krishna, is not on the personal level, it's on the individual level. Because you will have families all over New Delhi honouring and worshipping Krishna, right? Others Vishnu, right? Others Brahman. Right? So it's not the personalised element, it's only individual. It's like patronage, right?
It's like a contract.
Yes, it's a contract. Yes, and it's patronal in nature, right? Individualistic in nature. The personal element, immediately by usage of that kind of semantic, indicates a level of relational familiarity that is beyond just mere individual notions. Does that make sense? That's the one thing that kind of defines and marks Christianity as unique and different, and not just like unique in the abstract sense, but unique in a legitimate, measurable, codifiable way. That I will say though on the balance, because the counterbalance to that is this: the quicker we can put to a very quick death the aphorism of Christianity is not a religion but a relationship, the better. Common statements today like, well, I don't have a religion, I have a relationship, or Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship.
Jesus is my Lord. Yeah,
you don't understand the term religion, and you have this idea that religion is either this old bad thing that's like this crusty ecclesiastical structure, but the relationship is something somehow different or disconnected from that. No, we very much have a religion. The idea of separating the relational aspect from the religious aspect is just kind of modern reactionary rubbish. Right? What it's trying to do, it's very popular among millennials, and particularly to say it, what it's trying to do is it's trying to almost have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to disconnect itself from religion, ergo make itself popular in the modern cultural context, whilst also trying to keep the things that you're claiming you like from that religious aspect. Christianity is definitively a religion. It's perfectly good to have a religion. Christianity is a religion. We're unsure what the specific etymology of the word religion was. It most likely comes from the Latin religare, meaning to reconnect, namely reconnect to God. Well, that speaks pretty closely to the theology of justification, right? We have a religion, and it's perfectly good to have a religion. This is what this is. This is a religion. Like, the idea of shying away from it as a religion, because either one, it makes us feel like we then have something that the world doesn't, or more importantly, it makes Christianity more palatable to the world. There's a bunch of different reasons why it's done, but it's a silly statement. It's a silly phrase. Let's not go the whole, we don't have a religion, we have a relationship. No, we have a religion that is relationally founded. So continue on through, right, you're persecuting me. So verse 5, okay, which is where we're still moving through this interaction between Saul and Jesus here. And he said, this is Saul, and Saul says, "Who are you, Lord?" Now again, the reference to Lord as Kyrios is just a very generic reference here. Who are you? He's identifying him as something a bit beyond his normal experience. But who are you? Right? It's interesting. I mean, Saul's young here, like he's not an old man here by any stretch of the imagination. How much interaction he had in terms of bearing witness to the life and ministry of Jesus? Not quite sure. Like, we know he's young. Again, he's at the stoning of Stephen, he's identified as young, right? So again, keeping in mind young, probably like my age, right? So like not like 14, but like 20s to 30s, right? So how much interaction he had with, witnessing anything that Jesus did? We don't know, like we're not told. The Sanhedrin didn't have much of a issue, I'm sure, with identifying whether or not Jesus was Jesus beyond the resurrection. Like when they heard stories, like which they would have, from the 500 witnesses that saw him raised from the dead, and they heard people describing him, they probably would have gone, that sounds a lot like him, yeah. You know what I mean? Because they knew what he looked like, all these kind of things. They interacted with him all the time. Here Saul doesn't appear to know who he is. Now, could that be by virtue of this appearance being Christ in a glorified state? That could also actually be the reason. That could explain why he doesn't recognize. But either way, he doesn't recognize him. Okay? And he's referring to him as Kyrios in the Greek, right? He would have been speaking Aramaic, but in the Greek is where we're getting it recorded. He refers to him as Lord in the generic sense. And so Christ says back to him, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." Again, repeating again that what he just said to him just before, right? Verse 6, but...
Well, hang on, I've got another sentence.
Do you?
It is hard for me to kick against the goads.
Yes, okay, good.
Is that a variant as well?
Another variant.
God have mercy on us.
Yeah, another variant. And so you have KJV, correct?
Yeah.
Good,
Yes.
okay, yep. So I was going to circle back after I got this. So how does yours read?
I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks.
Yeah. So it's an interesting phrase. So this is where we get another textual variant that can occur. Which we had, was it last week or the week before? I forget which week it was. Pretty sure it was last week actually, in verse 37 or whatever the verse was.
It was 37.
Yeah. So again, another. I would need to go back and look at exactly. So I didn't cover that in my prep. What I would need to do is I would need to go back and look at what particular source material the KJV translators would have been using for Acts chapter 9. I can kind of do it simultaneously. Because not necessarily...
They use a Septuagint.
Oh no, so what I'm referring to, sorry, is... No, so I mean broadly. I know what they're using in terms of the Textus Receptus. what I mean is I'll need to then dive into the specifics around that textual variant and to see what kind of manuscripts that specific phrasing is coming from. That's what I meant, yeah. And so I would need to then go back and look at that specific textual variant. I was prepared for the other one last week. The specifics of what manuscripts that ending of verse 5, I'm guessing it is, at the end of verse 5, yeah, that the ending of verse 5 is coming from. I would need to go back and then have a look. Let's see if I can do something really quickly. Okay. In the Peshitta, interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That would be why. All right. So what it's coming from the Vulgate. So it's coming from the Latin Vulgate. So it's a Western textual tradition, right? It is in another Greek codex, Codex E and Codex 431, which are more well known, but I won't bore you with that part. Except it's in verse 4, not verse 5. So it's in a different verse. So some of them, in some manuscripts in the Latin Vulgate, for example, that's in verse 5, which is what you have there, right? Other manuscripts actually have it in verse 4. So Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for thee to kick against the priest. Yeah, so that's what happens. So that's where you start to know things are a textual variant, is when they start to appear in different verses. There are some other major ones, like, again, one of the big, I know I referenced it last time, but one of the biggest evidences against the pericope adulterae, or the woman caught in adultery, the evidence against that being original is the fact that it's found, when you actually go through the manuscripts, it's found all over the place. Some have it in John 3, others have it in like John 20, others have it in Luke 21, others have it in Luke 22, others have it in Luke 24, I think it is. I forget what chapters, like at all different points in the book. You can barely find a manuscript that has it in somewhere else that another manuscript actually has it in, which is what indicates that this is an added story that's kind of like looking for a place to call home kind of thing. So when you have textual variants that are in a different verse, that's kind of an indication that like it wasn't original, right? Because it's kind of like been later on, and it's starting to get mixed up into the verses. How that came about, again, every textual variant's different. There are ones I explained last time. A lot of the time they came from notes that people would write, and I explained last time that Christians in the modern day who write notes are upholding a long-standing Christian tradition of note writing in the margins or in such things. Christians who highlight their Bibles with different colour textures are engaging in a long-standing Christian tradition, just not with textures from Coles or from Kmart. Christians underline things all the time. Christians, little notes like that, yeah. And so a lot of the time, a big culprit is things being added on in the margins and notes added in the margins. That specific textual variant, I'd have to go back and look as to if we know at all how the textual variant came in. A statement like that, it's not so much a detail. It's basically like a proverbial statement. It's almost like an aphorism, a proverbial aphorism. I'd need to go back and have a look as to what the likelihood of how that ended up getting into the manuscript tradition. I can try and find out for you though. But yes, even just a cursory glance at what I'm looking at here can clearly tell it's not. It doesn't even go back the first 300 or 400 years probably. And so then again, Textus Receptus KJV translators wouldn't have had the awareness of that. As over the last 500 years, when we've then discovered a bomb load of these things, we then now do. So that would be the explanation. I can try and find out. I can probably do, after we finish here, I can probably do a quick 5-minute search and either will or will not reveal something to us. So yeah. So yes, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting, right? And then he gives this instruction in verse 6, but rise and enter the city, Damascus, and you'll be told what you are to do. He's speaking to him in a very, powerful but almost calm way. There's no like gigantic rebuke here. You know what I mean? Which is fascinating. There's no like stern. There is the rebuke in the sense of why are you persecuting me, but it's in this form of a question. Like it's not even like, it's not it which is interesting. It's a not necessarily passive way of doing it. It's more. It's a much gentler way in one sense, I suppose. It's not Saul, you know, doomed are you for persecuting me! Exclamation mark! Right? It's why are you persecuting? It's condemnatory, but in the form of a question, which engages the mind, right? Why are you persecuting me? It forces the mind to almost answer the question itself. But it's then not met with this giant, like we're not given some like 30 verse condemnation on Jesus' part, like say what he gave to the Pharisees and the Sadducees just before the Olivet Discourse, like Matthew 23. The woes against the Pharisees, and that full-blown condemnation of that wicked generation in Jerusalem. But he says, rise and enter and you will be told what you are to do. Right? And so then in verse 7, the men who were travelling with him... Yep, go ahead.
Can I just go back to verse 6?
Yep.
I am Jesus whom you are persecuting.
Yeah.
I do believe that's the only time Jesus says his name in Scripture.
Could be right. Off the top of my head, I would be inclined to guess yes to that. If there is an area... I'm scrolling through my head. If there is an area, I can't think of it. I dare say you're probably right.
So
I can't think of any in the gospel. I obviously no shortage of tangential remarks as to who he is. You know, I am the tree, I am the door, I am the vine, I am the this, I am the that. I am. You know, all the different. There's many I am statements. The 7 I am statements. Specifically reference to his actual personal name, not that I can necessarily think of.
If that's the case,
I think that would be wonderful when he said that.
If that's the case, that makes this
I dare say you're right. Yes.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Why now?
Yeah.
Personal.
Yeah.
The personal. More than just the individual.
Yeah.
The personal.
There's no touch that Saul would never have.
But we know from the way to explain the Bible, whenever something happens first time in Scripture is extremely important.
It has. Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously not to an endless degree, but yes, to a degree, yes, that's certainly true. Yeah. You know what? And this is where we circle back to one of the two major broad points here. Is one. Actually, I'll save the second one for the end. I'll just speak to the one now because it's more immediate. If you zoom out just a little bit and take a look at verses 4 through to, well, basically 4 and 5 essentially, just 4 and 5, very, very reminiscent, not just in terms of the wording, although there is slight difference, but broadly speaking, the way that the phrases of words are used, but then also the sequencing of the words. Verses 4 and 5 are very, very similar to the interaction in Exodus chapter 3 between God and Moses. Appearance in the burning bush, in light, falls to the ground. Who are you? I am who I am, the divine name. He reveals his name. Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, the name. It mirrors it almost, not entirely, but almost identically.
Paul would have understood that.
Yeah. You have to understand that this interaction here is purposefully mirroring the calling and interaction between God and Moses.
It's almost as if it's saying, I am Jesus, I am alive.
Yeah, that's a big part of it too, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Because Paul would have, I mean, obviously Saul at this point still, Saul, of course, would have disbelieved the resurrection accounts.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And so that...
Jesus of Nazareth, I'm alive.
I'm alive, yeah, exactly. And as evidenced by my speaking to you. And so there's that, and so that's a very good point. Yeah, exactly. And so that's added on top of that, or that's encapsulated in exactly that, what I'm referencing there, is that it's paralleling the calling of Moses.
Did the Pharisees believe in resurrection?
The Pharisees did.
I thought they did. It was
No,
the
they did. They did, and the
Sadducees.
Sadducees didn't. Yeah. The thing about the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that you can go down the list of things, of categories in theology, and it's just like, these guys did, these guys didn't. These guys did, these guys didn't. These guys did, these guys. So, like, sometimes remembering what's what. Do they believe in oral tradition? Yes, no. Do they believe in this? No, yes, no, yes, yes, no. Like, it's so going down the list. The Pharisees, resurrection. The Pharisees did, the Sadducees did not. I'm pretty sure that's the way, right? I'm pretty sure that's the right. Yes. Sometimes it can get tricky when you're trying to remember all the things they did and didn't in opposite of each other. Yeah. So him as a Pharisee, and he was a Pharisee, not a Sadducee. He's a Pharisee. He's a Pharisee. Yeah. So the concept of resurrection, the allowance for that, obviously was helpful. I think it is. I think it's not. Is it the foremost point? No, not necessarily. But it certainly is It's very much a constituent element of choosing Saul, by virtue of him being a Pharisee, not a Sadducee. If he was a Sadducee, this dynamic would have been really different. You know what I mean? Not impossible, obviously, but.
How many years have passed since Christ was resurrected?
At this point, we're not explicitly told, but it's within 2 years.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Or more like closer.
So he would have known, surely. Saul would have known that Christ had resurrected.
He would have
Heard it. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, in terms of that. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Did he believe it? No, but he didn't believe it. No. Gosh, no. He wouldn't have believed that at all. No. I mean, he would have. He's not. He's committed to this. He's committed to this operation for deeply held religious reasons. His goal is to annihilate Christianity. Like his purpose is explicitly genocidal. It's not just merely I want to suppress this. I want to make sure we contain it. Like the stated purpose here is genocidal. Like it's the annihilation of any human being who would ever call themselves a Christian. That's the express purpose here.
Yeah, look, that's very interesting because are you aware of the book written in the late 1800s by the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Greenwald?
Yes.
He was a non-believer,
Been a while,
just
but
for
yes.
those who don't know of him. He was a Jewish background, but an unbeliever, and he expressly set out to write a book disproving the Christian Bible, disproving it, and he ended up becoming a believer.
Of course.
Not the first time that's happened either.
No, of course. But he came at it, of course, from a legal point of view. So he was looking for the legal evidence. There's a lot of legal evidence in the Gospels, like the
100%.
more than 500 witnesses
Very
who
much
saw
so.
Jesus resurrected.
Yeah.
Paul, just going back to what was said, I think you said, Irene, Saul would have heard of Jesus' resurrection.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
but
Yeah, he wouldn't have
didn't
believed it. He would have heard it.
But the
100%.
thing
Everyone
is,
would have.
Saul was a lawyer.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was legally trained. Yeah.
So, and just harking back to what you said earlier on in this Bible study, that he was in charge of a precision, investigative committee,
Yep.
spying, interrogating.
Yeah, massive intelligence
He
operation.
would have interrogated at least one of those more than 500 witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. He must have.
And if not directly, he would have had the report of all of them.
So from a legal point of view, he had a very clever legal mind, arguably the cleverest legal mind. He would have realised very soon that the legal evidence would have stood up in any court of law. So there were no holes in the evidence.
Correct, yeah.
But
which is why the courts are such kangaroo courts. But yeah, go on.
So he heard of Jesus' resurrection. He did some investigation. Legally speaking, he couldn't find a loophole. He couldn't find any evidence against the resurrection. And therefore, he was, legally speaking, he knew of the resurrection, but spiritually speaking, he was blind.
Correct.
That's why he didn't recognise Jesus.
Yeah, and that's why the whole blindness thing comes into it here. Yeah, exactly, and that's done on purpose too. Yeah, exactly. That's, I mean, the when Christians point to the logical, kind of the very Socratic, logical outlining of how we know the resurrection must have logically occurred. the reason why we do that is not just for mere sophistry or just merely like, this really academic, technical kind of, exercise. It's because the scriptures are presenting the reality and the actual historical record and the eyewitness accounts, which are detailed not just in the scriptures but by sources beyond just the Bible, right, that were primary source evidence of the first century, is pointing towards the fact that there is no logical explanation that takes the evidence that we're given from multiple sources, biblical and extra-biblical, that can then explain how that evidence fits without the actual accounting of it, i.e. it's because he was raised from the dead, being true. Does that make sense? You have a horrifically bad time trying to explain how apparently multiple guards fell asleep just of their own whim on that night. The idea that because not only would any generic Joe Schmo guard, you might be able to argue, yes, one. It's entirely possible that some 18-year-old rookie falls asleep on the job. The idea that all of them fall asleep, beyond the pale. Moreover, not just all of them, but you don't understand how the world works, especially that world, if you think that those were amateurs who would have been posted to that guard. I can guarantee you, and again, it's been widely accepted that this would not have been amateurs posted to guard the tomb of the most famous man in that part of the world in that day. Okay? These would have been experienced men, right? Very experienced.
At the threat of death.
Correct. Who by the way, under the threat of death, because it's the punishment for failing to do your duties, right? We know that because that happens later on, right? The guards who allow Peter to escape, miraculously, are then put to death by Herod. So any idea of trying to magically squirm your way into having a scenario where apparently 4 battle-hardened guards fell asleep on the job, beyond pale of logic.
Saul knew all of this.
Oh, knew all this. And we know for a fact that the body wasn't there, apart from the fact that you can go and see the empty tomb today. Apart from that fact, all of this would have been resolved like that if none of this occurred. All the disciples were just constantly tripping on DMT and just making up stories, and all the Jewish authorities would have had to done is go, well, but there's the tomb and the body's inside it, so what are you talking about? But they couldn't, because no body.
Would you safely describe Saul, therefore, as amazingly stubborn?
Oh,
Well, it could be.
only a little bit. Yeah. Stubborn. And stubbornness,
And
stiff-necked, and prideful, yes, exactly.
Would those adjectives by any chance apply to the nation of Israel?
Yeah, often, yeah. Stubborn, and yeah. How many times in the Old Testament are they referred to as stubborn and stiff-necked, right? And that's not meant to be an insult, it's just the description that's given. Yes, it's a stubbornness. It's a stubbornness, and it's not just that, it's a stubbornness that befalls all people, right? It's a stubbornness that befalls people when they are doggedly committed to a particular viewpoint in the face of contradictory evidence. Okay?
Like modern day
people can be committed. People can be committed to a position, and that's people being committed to a position. That's not the issue. The issue is being committed to a position, being then exposed to contradictory evidence, which can be demonstrated to be contradictory, and more importantly, be demonstrated to actually be sustainable evidence, right? Not just surface prima facie level, but actual sustainable evidence. And then that coming into contact with your deeply held belief about insert whatever we're talking about, and a refusal to change, right? Because of the cognitive dissonance that's experienced, cognitive dissonance being the proverbial chasm that exists between what you believe and between new evidence, right? Or things that are being demonstrated that are contradictory, right? And human beings do it all the time, right? Without being smart, Christians do it all the time. Sure. Right? We're not immune to it by any stretch of the imagination. Because what happens is we become committed to an idea, and we can sometimes lose sight of what should be the commitment to the truth. Okay, that's a distinction that occurs.
I'm not
for people.
blaming him.
No, I'm not either. No, but
if I'm blaming him, then I'm blaming myself.
Oh, same deal. Yeah, exactly. No, I get exactly what you're saying. Yes, and so, but a commitment to the truth will lead you at times to have differing opinions on things. So there are things in the past that I've dramatically changed my theological views on, because I held to X, was demonstrated something different from the scriptures, and realized, okay, so the system or the position that I hold on, insert whatever, is incorrect. If I actually genuinely care about having sworn allegiance to the God of truth, my position changes. Because am I aligned or am I in liege to my position or to the truth? Which one? Truth, ergo your position changes. It has to work that way. And that's how you can tell, that's how you can measure whether someone is genuinely committed to truth or not.
Well, here we have a miraculous conversion by Saul.
Yeah.
Miraculous.
Yeah, exactly right. Miraculous by every possible definition, yeah, exactly. You know, and we'll continue on with that miraculous. So there's a number of more details here. So let's continue on with this part. Right. So verse 8. I missed verse 7. So verse 7. There's a response to the details that are then given by Luke in 7 through 9. Verse 7. The men who were travelling with him, right, his team, the men who were travelling with him stood speechless, right, shocked in other words, hearing a voice but seeing no one. Right. So they're not encountering whatever he's encountering here. No. Okay, and there's a reason for that. They can hear the voice. We get a little bit of an explanation later, but they couldn't understand it. They couldn't comprehend it, right? And they can get into some details there in a second. But anyway, they hear the voice but see no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing, right? So he's been blinded by this. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Probably because he was too busy throwing up. And fasting, yeah, true fasting, and probably having a difficult time keeping food down in the first place by the sheer shock of what he just experienced. A couple of things here. So his team can't see this going on. He can. They can hear something, but they don't see anything.
They
going
didn't
on
see
at
the
all.
light? No.
No indication. No. I don't think there's any indication they saw the light. That's a question that's been asked a lot of times.
I don't think they saw the light.
Oh, they saw the light but didn't see him? I don't think they saw anything. You can... Is it beyond the pale to argue that? You have a difficult time stretching the Greek phraseology of they saw nothing to somehow mean the light but not him.
Heard.
It's a difficult time, yeah. I think it stretches too far beyond what Luke's saying here in the Greek.
Yeah.
They saw nothing. They didn't see anything. They knew something was happening. Out of nowhere, Saul falls to the ground and is now talking to no one.
He was probably on a horse, wasn't he? So he fell off the horse onto the ground.
Yes, it doesn't say that, but yes, it's likely. In all likelihood, would have been these guys would have been riding. Yeah, almost certain. They're generally like that. They're not
going to walk.
They're not
1,000
walking.
kilometres.
They're not walking. It's unlikely it was a chariot, but riding. They would have wanted the mobility. They wouldn't have had a chariot, but yes, but there are plenty of times where people have been travelling, and you can clearly tell, like by the distances they're travelling, that they travelled by horseback. But but we're not told explicitly that they rode on horseback. It's just we're told that they travelled, but they clearly would have been travelling on horseback because no one would have walked that. not even this. I mean, like Paul's missionary journeys. Paul would have used horses all the time. But we're not explicitly told to use a horse.
No.
Like where he didn't walk from Jerusalem to Athens.
Plus they were planning on retrieving prisoners.
Yeah.
And where would they have put the prisoners? They would have had carriages or something, horses.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And so
makes sense.
Yeah. So he's fallen. So I'm using that to try and point to the fact that they would have. We're told like they were speechless. They stood like they're speechless. Like they're like shocked by what's going on here. They can clearly tell something's happening, but they can't comprehend what's going on. They don't see anything. They may have thought, are we under attack?
And they would have heard Saul ask,
that's what I'm saying. That's what I mean by talk to no one. Yeah.
Who are you, Lord?
They would have been hearing him talk to no one, as far as they were perceiving it, is what I mean. Yeah. So, but there's a reason for that, because the reason why this is occurring is not just the pragmatics of the conversion, but the just as, if not even more important pragmatics of him seeing the resurrected Christ, and that being a prerequisite qualification of his apostolic role.
Yes, because he had to be witnesses of that.
Correct. It is in, I'm going to get the exact specific reference, I think it's Colossians, though don't quote me. Actually, no, maybe it was Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let's have a look. Yeah, it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? This is not merely in a visionary sense. This is actually, he's saying, like, it comes across a lot more obviously in the Greek, but it does a pretty good job in the English. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? This doesn't mean in an abstract sense. This doesn't mean even in a visionary sense. The way he's using the Greek words here is exactly how Peter could have used those words. So you might go, okay, interesting.
He also said, as though in an untimely birth.
Yeah, exactly. And that, the untimely birth is a phrase, it has a number of meanings, but it's not really the focus of this morning, but it refers, certainly one of the foremost reasons that it refers to is untimely birth, as in his conversion in the face of what he was doing, and untimely in the sense of this is after death, burial, resurrection, not like the apostle, the other apostles, Peter, John, who were all in the upper room, who were all there at Pentecost, all those kind of things which happened before. That's the untimely aspect. Does that make sense? And the birth obviously referring to like new birth, conversion. This is by every possible definition. It's important to point this out too. I know it might seem trivial, but it's not. This is a very special, unique, completely unique circumstance. Again, this is one of those areas, like there are many, where the distinction between normative and narrative has to take place. Right? We've explained that before, right? An important biblical hermeneutic is distinguishing between normative things and narrative things. Narrative being things that are accounted, right, as part of the broader story. They're things that happened, but shouldn't be taken as normative, as in this is what the normal standard or practice of X, whatever it is, should be, right? Jesus walking on water, narrative, not normative. You go try and do it, you can get very wet, right? This is narrative, not normative. Like categorically, this is so obviously narrative, not normative. There are people who think this should be normative. It's not.
The absolute uniqueness of this event explains why Jesus announced himself as I am Jesus.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah, exactly right. All this is just screaming narrative, not normative. It also means, by the way, and this is one of the bigger meta-narrative points, is that we're not explicitly told. I think this is just one of those things that the scriptures would describe as mysterion, right? Mystery. This is, I'm going to try and use English in the way that can encapsulate what I'm thinking here. This is something that's not just merely a vision. Something's going on here where it's something beyond vision. What I don't really have, the scriptures don't really give us a full revealed picture of this.
It was an apparition.
Basically. Yeah, I tossed back and forth in my head about the word apparition and whether to use it. Because apparition, when we think of apparition, we just think of like a ghost. So it's not like that. But apparition, at least in part, yes. Not in the sense of how we commonly use the word apparition. Like we think of like a ghost, like ooh, like that's how we think of apparition generally. But but this is something this is an appearing
There's
of
a better
Christ.
word for it. It's a Greek word, you know it, it's parousia.
Yeah, parousia, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, basically, yeah, parousia is the best possible way of, and that's me, that's what I'm saying, I'm trying to think in English what's the best way of encapsulating, yeah. This is something that requires, because this is not just a vision.
It's an appearance.
It's an appearance. It's because, and the reason why I can say that is the way that Paul speaks about it in what we just read in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1. He is using the word seen as I'm sitting in this room seeing you right now, right? Yet it's not, so it's something beyond just visionary. It is something beyond merely just like a dream, for example, or something like that. It's something a lot more, because it wouldn't meet the qualification of him having seen the resurrected Christ, which was the prerequisite for that office or that role of apostle. Yeah.
You know what it equates to? It just occurred to me, and you said it. It's the exact same appearance as to the apostles in the upper room where Jesus materialized.
Yes.
And that makes sense because Paul is an apostle.
Correct. That's what I'm trying to point to.
And he had to have the same appearance.
Exactly. And this is what's hilarious is that, like, kind of when I've explained that before, I remember one time explaining it, and kind of there was almost this sense of like doubt. It was like, oh no, it sounds a bit weird. Like almost in like not just, I don't mean like in the textual sense, like, oh, that's not quite in keeping with other things in the text. I mean like materially, like logically, like, oh, do you really think we're talking about the creator of matter?
Yes.
What are you talking about? As if he didn't possess the power to do this? The idea that it's illogical is hilarious. Like you're talking about, so he had the ability, so he possesses as God the capability of creating the atomic and subatomic structure of the universe ex nihilo, but apparently can't pull this off. It's no different than like when you're talking about instances like, well, I referenced it earlier, like walking on water. Where you're talking, it is a reference to the God who created the very molecular structure of water, and you'd think he can't somehow manipulate, change, work with it to walk on top of it. It makes no sense. The idea that, oh yes, he can create it but can't do anything with it doesn't logically proceed. If he has the capability and the power to create it, of course he has the capability and the power to change, manipulate, or act upon it to be able to then walk on it. Like we're taught the orders of priority in terms of like, it's like someone who can tie their shoelaces and do all these incredible knots but can't figure out Velcro. Like, of course they could figure out Velcro. Like, it's not... Like, it's not... Do you understand what I mean? It's just like if they can achieve this, they can achieve this, logically. It's hilarious how we do it. It's such a materialistic view of the world, yeah.
I would hope that there aren't many Christians who find it...
I'm not claiming there is. I just mean people generally. Even beyond the pale of Christianity. Like the idea that you
But they go to witches and crystal ball clairvoyance.
Yeah, it's just...
And they don't believe in material...
Or reference their horoscope from Woman's Weekly, yeah. Like, it's like it happens all the time. Like it's not like the same. Yeah, exactly. Like the amount of people like millennials or like my generation, Gen Z, like who talk about like they broke up because they're a Virgo but their boyfriend was a Leo, and you're like, but you jump off the train when it comes to God walking on water, like as if that's somehow logically incongruous. You don't want to believe. It's got nothing to do with evidence. It's got nothing to do with proofs. It's got nothing to do with validations. You wouldn't. God could literally appear in the room right now, and you wouldn't believe because you don't want to.
But he lacked evidence because the other man saw it was no blinded.
Yeah. Exactly, and we're going to get onto that point in a minute. No, you haven't jumped. You've introduced it. You haven't jumped. There's no jumping the gun necessarily. You've segued us into that broader point. Yes, which comes up in a minute. Right. Well, it comes up by the time we get towards the end of this passage. So we'll put the bookmark in that, and then we'll catch up with it when we get to the end. So, verse 10. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. Again, it's not the focus of the text. You have to use logic and apply logic from the text. Why is there a disciple? Forget the name. The Ananias part's not relevant. Why is there any disciple in Damascus?
Because there's a church.
Right. And how did the church start in Damascus?
After Stephen's stoning.
Right. And the church did what? The diaspora. Dispersed. Right?
Scattered.
Right. We've just had that all throughout chapter 7. Right. Sorry, chapter 8. Sorry. And the accounting of those dispersions, and obviously the journeys of Philip the deacon and so on. Right. And all that kind of stuff, right? And set up in Samaria and et cetera, right? Damascus being obviously up northeast of Samaria, so up that way, right? And so a church has been planted in Damascus, right? So actually I'm going to say that point to the end because it comes across a lot better when I say it to the end. So there's a disciple in Damascus because there's a church in Damascus, which, as I said to you at the top, is the impetus and the reason for him getting warrant and the green light to conduct an operation in a Damascus, right? It wouldn't have been random and say he's not just casting a wide net. They would have known that the church of Jerusalem spread out, right? They would have heard that, they would have known it, because they would have been monitoring the activity of the church in Jerusalem in the first place. So now they're out all around Judea and Samaria and etc., right? And the different different regions and kingdoms, hunting down and searching. They would have got a confirmed or verified report from Damascus, from their assets in Damascus. There's a church here, the Christians are here. He's then going into Damascus to conduct operation on the back, logically speaking, of intelligence, right? So then the Lord says to him, as in this Ananias, he says to him in a vision, Ananias, calls him by name. And he said, "Here I am, Lord." "Who are you, Lord?" "Here I am, Lord." Doesn't know who he is. Does know who he is. Do you see the difference? The other big part of this too, by the way, as to what indicates to us that what was going on with Saul was something beyond the pale of a vision, is that now Luke starts referring to visions.
Yeah.
Okay? The Lord said to Ananias in a vision, Ananias, right? He says, "Here I am, Lord." Verse 11, the Lord said to him, "Rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands upon him so that he might regain his sight." So now Saul has a vision. He has a vision of God sending Ananias to pray for him and for his sight to be restored. Vision. And we're told that's a vision, but yet we're given no reference to vision back in this interaction with Jesus. That's the internal, what's called the internal evidence. Right, we explained that concept before. Internal evidence is what is the evidence from within the text as to what on earth the text means. Right? Internal evidence. That is the internal evidence that Saul at that point still, that Saul's interaction with Jesus was not just merely a vision, is the fact that it's not referred to as a vision, whereas things literally right after it are referred to as a vision. Okay? That's one of the internal evidences. He says to him, "Go to the street that is called Straight." This is exactly what it was known as in those days. This was essentially the main street of Damascus, called Straight because, as you might have well guessed, in your great ingenuity, it was straight. It was straight. It ran from the east gate to the west gate. Ran for about just a little under 5 kilometres, roughly. Damascus is a big city. This is not just some backwater town. Damascus is a major city. And the main street of Damascus, which is just called the Straight, ran straight through the middle of it from the east to the west gate, and would have connected the King's Highway coming in from the east to the Via Maris coming out the west side, and went for about 5 kilometres. This house of Judas, who this Judas is, we're not sure. There is some logical implications that can give us a bit of an idea. Some have proposed that this was the house. There are those who have proposed that this was the house of a Christian. Others who have proposed it was the house of an unbelieving Jew. It's biological inference. So some have argued this is the house that that Saul at this point still was going to in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Right, and this was basically a safe house that Saul and his operation would have been working out of while in Damascus.
So therefore non-believers.
So therefore, non-believers. Others have tried to argue that this actually was the house of a Christian in Damascus, because that's how Ananias could have even got in the door in the first place. Here's the thing, though. Logically speaking, I think it lines up a lot better logically, and it is a logical inference, but it's not without warrant. It's from the text. We're taking the internal evidence of the text and then applying logic. Logically speaking, it appears far more likely, that this was the house of an unbeliever. Why do I say that? Because keeping in mind that this guy has been brought to this house by his team,
Yes, of course. Yeah.
right? To this particular house, which they already clearly knew of. They weren't given. Jesus didn't tell them, go to this house of Judas. He's telling Ananias that Saul is already at the house of Judas, not the other way. You know what I mean? It's not the other way around, right? So it's not Jesus telling Saul, and now go to the house of Judas and you will find. It's the other way around. He's gone to the house of Judas, so now he's telling Ananias go to the house of Judas. So that Saul has gone there. Saul and his team have gone there of their own impetus. That lines up more logically with that being already a predetermined location and something akin to a safe house as part of this operation.
Other than Judas, the half-brother of Jesus,
Sure.
is he, who is elsewhere referred to as Joey, I believe? Is that right?
I believe so, yes. I need to go and check, but yeah, I believe so.
Is there another, I think there is another Judas later on in the...
There is, not Judas Iscariot.
In the Pauline letters, there's another Judas.
Yeah, there is.
Could be this Judas who was then converted.
Maybe. Yeah, I'm forgetting that if there's an epithet given to that Judas later on. I need to go back and have a look. To my knowledge, in having read up on it, to my knowledge, we're not sure who this Judas is.
No.
At least in any concrete or definitive sense.
It's probably quite a common name, though, yeah?
One of the most common names.
It's like Joseph.
Yeah, it's a Judah. Yeah, exactly. But Judas is just Judah. That's what it is. It's just in the Aramaic. This is as common. This is as common as anything today. John. Yeah, just name a name. Yeah, exactly. It's a common as. So that doesn't help us. That doesn't give us like some particular. If it was an even remotely unique name, or even just less common name, we may have some indication. But we're not. To the best of my knowledge, and all I've ever seen or read, we're not sure who this Judas was, and it's not even really the point. But yeah,
the relations. The interconnectedness between the characters in the New Testament are often, still to this day, to me, very surprising. For example, because everyone knew one another.
Yeah.
Isn't it the case that Mark was the nephew of Barnabas?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, they were. Yeah, to Barnabas, yes.
So all these, they all knew each other. It wasn't a huge community.
No. There's a lot of
Christians today.
No.
We know Christians in Melbourne and Sydney without even having met them.
Yeah, exactly. And we find out, or you come to a place and you find out, like we've had plenty of times here where we've had visitors from, insert generic town wherever, and you find out that there's some nexus point where like.
Definitely.
They used to be at such and such church, and did you know blah blah? Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, that happens all the time. Yeah, even today with a much larger population sample size of Christians and the general populace alike. Yeah, exactly. So yes, logically speaking, this was a house they were already coordinated to go to in the first place. That would most likely explain why they're there, because they go there of their own impetus. Yeah. So nevertheless, Ananias is being told here by Christ, again, go to the street that's called Straight, like go to the main street, Damascus. At the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus, or from Tarsus, named Saul. For behold, he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming and praying for him. He's seen you, or he's seen the future. Again, this is the first time we're given this kind of reference, again, Saul being from Tarsus. I think this is the second time we're told he's from Tarsus. We were told earlier he's from Tarsus. And him being from Tarsus is just part. We'll get into it later on about the specifics of some of that background of his Tarsian background that becomes a bit more relevant later as to why, the whole background of Saul and the impact and the importance that had upon his calling and ministry. We'll discuss that later when Saul starts to become more detailed in the focus, because this chapter is basically the beginning of the transition in Acts. When you think of the whole book of Acts, these first eight chapters have been focused on the apostles, yes, but Peter, really. Peter and the apostles, right? Peter and the Church of Jerusalem, right? It's been very Petrine focused. We're now starting to get a shift to a more Pauline focus, right? Where certainly by chapter let's call it 15, 16. From 15 onward, Paul is the main character of Acts, certainly, right? And it's kind of in this transition. We're beginning this transition in the book of Acts towards Paul, away from Peter, not to the neglect of, just in terms of the literary accounting of history, right? And so he sees this. He's been given this vision of Ananias coming to him, right? So Ananias' response in verse 13, but Ananias answered, Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. Right, so again, Paul's reputation. That's what I'm saying about this, how we know how big this intelligence operation was, right? Because these guys in Damascus had been Christian for not a terribly long amount of time, and they were already intimately acquainted with the operations against the Christians that was going on in Jerusalem, right? By virtue of the fact that the church in Damascus was founded by the church in Jerusalem, right? And by those deacons and other Christians that dispersed to, including other places, Damascus, right? And so verse 14, and here he has authority from the chief priests to bind, like to capture all those who call on your name.
How did Ananias know this?
Because I'm saying to you about the network, the operation, this is again internal evidence. This is how we know this wasn't Saul just taking a stab in the dark and going, let's go see if there are Christians in Damascus. They already have assets in Damascus. They already have a network of assets as part of their intelligence operation in Damascus reporting on Christians. The Christians are aware that Jerusalem has assets in Damascus.
So that's
how he knows this.
The spying went both ways?
Yes, correct. Which is why I tried to point out last time, yeah.
It's like the underground is in the wall.
Yeah, basically, yes. Because guess what the Christians were doing? They were conducting counterintelligence. Counterintelligence.
That's interesting.
This is it's fascinating, yeah. And this is not the first time the Christians have done it. Christians have done this a lot of times. I explained this last time in brevity, but it kind of speaks to the same point, right? Concerning William Tyndale. The translator, not the first, but the biggest and most impactful translator of the Bible into English in the 1530s primarily. He had to flee England, right, because the Crown had put out warrant for his death. He flees to the continent, and he's transported up and down the Rhine, right, throughout the empire, throughout the Holy Roman Empire, all the way to the North Sea to what they would call the Netherlands, translating along the way, right? And those Bibles, which are now being printed with printing presses that Christians bought and that Christians built, so they now had printing presses, right? These Bibles were being printed by, the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions, right? Eventually, and being transported in secret back up the Rhine into the North Sea and across the North Sea to England. Even that aspect alone requires significant planning, very tightly controlled and managed logistics, and coordination. That's also virtually, at least a military scale operation, and they were hidden in barges with potatoes and with other things, other stock and other.
Like Brother Andrews.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. And people were smuggled in those same vessels, and they entered England illegally, and they broke the law, and oh my goodness, they defied the crown. Oh no, what bad Christians they must have been.
There was a lot of surveillance going on.
Yeah, correct, and that's why. And the other thing too is that to keep Tyndale alive for as long as they managed to keep him alive required significant counterintelligence.
Yeah.
The Christians on the continent, as well as back in England, but for him specifically, we know for a fact, a humongous amount of resources, not just in terms of financial resources and logistical ones, but personnel resources were invested in keep this man alive, right?
Wow.
Thousands upon thousands of Christians whose they had one job: keep William Tyndale alive. You are one little cog in the greater machine. You know nothing about the rest of the machine because you can't know, because we're not going to tell you, so that if you get caught, you don't break the whole thing. You know nothing, right? And you are one little cog. And understand the scale, right? Your job was once every 3 months, you collect William Tyndale from this port, you put him on a different ship, you transport him down to this port, you get off, and you don't speak, you don't see, you do nothing. That's all you do. You do not talk to him, you do not say anything, you do not mention it. You go from this port to this port, and you get off, and you'll see him again in 3 months. When in 3 months you'll pick him up from that port and take him back to that port, and you will not say a word to him, you will not say your name, you will do nothing. And that's your job, Christian.
Did they make a movie, have they?
Oh, they should. They should. It'd be a brilliant. It'd be an espionage classic. They should if they were half smart, if they want some money, right? Humongous, and that was your job, right? And that's how it happened, right? And so they were extremely careful. They were extremely careful about who they allowed around Tyndale. And the only reason that the reason that Tyndale got caught, to give the proverbial devil his due, is because the empire, and more specifically the empire being paid by the English, just did a very good job of getting him. And it took the asset that they planted in that church where he was eventually caught, had been there for 2 years. 2 years of waiting, 2 years of gathering intelligence, 2 years of waiting, just for the right moment. Gaining trust that took years to gain, 2 years to gain that trust. Right? It's a long game if there ever was one. And this was just the asset that worked, by the way. They tried before. They tried with many other assets and other spies that had failed and been caught and had been rooted out. This is just the one that worked. And all it took was one night. They're walking to a location. Instead of turning left, they turn right, down the alleyway, Holy Roman Empire guards. And that's Tyndale done. One little left versus one little right, ta-da. Right? But to keep Tyndale alive for as long as they kept him alive for required so many moving parts. It's a fact, and that's just the surface level of explained. I could be here all day talking about it. Significant operation that was required to just keep him alive in the counterintelligence, and they're doing an early light LITE version of that here, because they know that Jerusalem's got assets.
It's pretty obvious.
They were
to persecuted from Stephen's stoning.
Yeah, exactly.
And they knew what the Sanhedrin was like. The Sanhedrin had sent out spies to suss out Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And all that, yeah, they know. And so they're conducting their own counterintelligence operation. Yeah, it's fascinating. So he knows, he's heard about them, right? And his response is not like, his response here is like, you want me to go see Saul? Like, he would have been like shocked and apprehensive, which without being smart, anyone in his position would have been. No, we can't fault him for that. We shouldn't fault him for that. His immediate apprehension is very, very, very understandable, right? But in verse 15, the Lord says to him in verse 15, go. Right? He says, go. Why? For he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And this kind of Ananias' response would have just been, okay. That's what his response would have been.
Remember how earlier you said that when Jesus first spoke to Saul, it wasn't in any condemnatory tone?
Yeah.
It was neutral. Well, he tells Ananias what's going to happen to Saul.
Yeah.
And then Ananias would have, out of truth, conveyed that to Saul.
Yeah.
Saul found out what he was going to face.
Yeah, exactly.
Great affliction and persecution.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And
because he already sowed those seeds against.
Yeah, and exactly, and that's an interesting point to raise too, because it's something that's kind of sometimes get overlooked. And in fairness, different theologians will have differences of opinion on this one, because it's not explicitly stated in like the kind of verbiage we would like it to often say. We often want the scriptures to be really, really succinct to us in English, which sometimes they're not. the purpose of his persecutions and all the just horrific things he kind of suffered through, right, that he explains, later on in his epistles, right, about being shipwrecked multiple times, being beaten, being tortured, being flogged, being starving, being exposed to the winter cold, blah blah, all these kind of things. That was certainly the big picture thing as to why that happened, is because that was part and parcel of being in his position and doing the things that he was doing, right? Literally and figuratively out on a limb as a missionary, right? So that was part and parcel of the job. I don't think one can this is me now mounting the argument, I don't think that it can be automatically overlooked that level of hardship was just merely coincidence and not at least even at an intermediate level tied to what he had done to Christians before, right? People sometimes get really hesitant when that gets said, because it's like, oh, but hold on, he was justified before God, his eternal punishment was accounted from Christ, right? All that's true. No one's questioning whether or not that's the case. No one's saying that. But there are temporal consequences in this world for things that are done in this world, right? That's why, again, normative versus narrative, or narrative versus normative, Paul suffering that level of hardship, I don't think can be automatically looked as, if you're a Christian and you're not getting absolutely torn to shreds like Paul was, you're not doing it right. That's a non sequitur, okay? Because normative versus narrative, because without being smart, not all the apostles suffered as much in life as Paul did.
Yeah.
All of them, bar John, were executed, like they were murdered, but they didn't all suffer across the span of years, is what I mean. Across the span of years, they didn't suffer as much as Paul did. Some of them not even close, right? Were they somehow not doing their job properly? No, that's not the implication at all. You again, as the Proverbs say, you sow the wind, you will reap the hurricane, right? You reap what you sow, right? And that can't be overlooked here. That's all I'm trying to point out, right? Is the temporal consequences of actions done in the world can reap temporal consequences in the world. That's all I'm pointing out, right? You know what I mean?
Ananias is prophesying here.
Yes.
He's in the position of a prophet because the Lord
Certainly
said to him in a vision.
Yeah.
Who else does the Lord speak to in Scripture?
And visions and give words. They're prophets.
He speaks to prophets. And not only that, he answers in Hebrew, Hineni, which all the prophets used to answer, "Here I am, Lord."
Yeah, exactly.
Samuel answered that.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
So Ananias is clearly a prophet.
Yeah.
Jesus
He's fulfilling a
gives
prophetic role, exactly.
Ananias a prophecy about Paul's future afflictions.
Yeah, and I think that would have sat, again, as I'm saying, his initial apprehension, really can't be faulted. It's not, we'd have the same reaction. It's almost like the immediate, again, the cognitive dissonance. Saul, the guy who's hunting us all down, rounding us up and murdering and slaughtering us all like pigs, I'm now going to use him to convert the world. That's a big jump to someone who you just told this 2 seconds ago. It's not, and so his initial Saul, as in the Saul, the guy who right? But then he points out again, wherever he says it, where did he say it? Verse 16. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. I think Ananias, his immediate response would have been, okay.
Paul
Yeah.
was persecuted by his chief priests and Levites.
Yeah, correct. Exactly right. Yeah, and we get onto that later on in this chapter, in the next couple of weeks, right? Where immediately it's turned right back on him. Yeah.
If this is a prophecy, and I do believe it is,
sure.
It's interesting then that it goes on to prophesy other things, including, look at the order.
Yeah.
To carry my name before heathens.
Yep.
And even kings.
Yeah.
And lastly, children of Israel.
Yeah.
Isn't that the order is very interesting there?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it fits in with other prophecy.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, Yeah, and it's especially and it's that you are right, A, on that point, and then B, secondarily, it's the real. This is again something about the transitory period in which we're entering here in Acts, in terms of the trajectory of the book of Acts, is that now, again, this is such a very obvious and overt transition to the Gentile context. Did that make sense? Yeah. And so in verse 17, right, and this is now Luke coming back and recounting. So Ananias departed and entered the house, right, he obeyed, and laying his hands on him, Saul, he said, "Brother Saul." That shows you that, I don't know, we obviously were not told where Ananias was in the city, but in the 2, 3, 4 kilometre journey that would have had to make to that house of Judas, he clearly had enough time to let it sink into his head that yes, this is real, and yes, I'm now to treat this monster as a brother. And so the first words out of his mouth, "Brother Saul," that shows you that Ananias did his job and that he got the message. And the initial apprehension he had, which was logical and perfectly understandable, had clearly dissipated. And he had accepted. Again, strongly held beliefs versus the truth. Ananias is clearly a Christian whose allegiance was to the truth, not his own feelings. So good for him. Christians can go ahead and name their kids Ananias. So he departs, entered the house, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you," and again, appearing, coming from the Greek, it's not just this purely visionary. So it's against the same kind of language as Jesus appearing in the upper room, for example, right? Yeah, as I'm saying to you, there's something, this was not just a vision, there was something, this was a legitimate appearance that's unique, that shouldn't be expected to be replicated, that shouldn't be expected to happen like to just any one of us, right? This is something unique and that is narrative, not normative, right? Hence that kind of terminology again, the internal evidence, right? But "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Then immediately, again, says verse 18, this is interesting on Luke's part, and I'll cover it in a sec, but immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he rose and was baptized. Yeah, exactly, and taking food, he was strengthened. So again, a couple of things here, obviously. This is probably the doctor in Luke coming out here in the text a little bit. Something like scales fell from his eyes. Something like scales, like something like a veil is what the reference is there. Yeah, almost. Yeah, cataract. Yeah, something like late stage cataracts fell from his eyes. Yeah. I'm going to try and find. Let me have a look here. Imagine the eyes. Something like. That'd be nice. I'm just going back. Yeah, I figured. Yeah, it's a hapax, as you can imagine. It's a hapax legomenon in the Bible, right? So again, hapax legomenon, a word that appears only once in the entire Bible. So in its coming back to it here, if I can find it, because I already lost it. Where are we? Yeah, in its nominative plural form here, lepides, or just in its root form, lepius, it literally refers to the scales of a fish. That's the literal reference, right? So I think, though, but again, was there actually something, like, did his physiology change where he was blinded by some actual thing coming over his eyes? The internal evidence would say no. Why do I say that? Luke's own wording of almost vagary, something like scales fell from his eyes, as well as the fact that back in verse 8 it says, although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So I don't think there was some, like, that God miraculously did something to his eyes that they were like covered. I think something like scale. He's speaking metaphorically here. He's using metaphor to describe something real. Something like scales fell from his eyes. Yeah, exactly. He couldn't see. He was blinded. Eyes open. You could see his eyes, but he was blinded. He couldn't see anything. But something like scales fell from his eyes, verse 18, and he regained his sight. Again, this was done for all, same kind of reasons as elsewhere, right? It's to demonstrate the validity of the message. That's what these miraculous signs and wonders were for, to validate to validate the message, and in essence prove a point, right? To serve as a testimony. You were blind, but now you see. It's as straightforward as that. I know it seems really trivial, but it is as straightforward as that. He blinded him so that he could bring back his sight for a multitude of reasons. One, you were blind, but now you see. You were blind, and I'm the only one who can make you see. Part of this as well would have been the natural consequence of seeing this light of the glorified Christ. Hence why the prophets could not behold God and see him. Hence why Moses had to veil and cover his face. And all these kinds of various implications that come from that. So there's a number of different theological points that are drawn here, but they're all tangentially tied to the concept of blindness versus sight. And so he then rose and was baptized, again presumably by Ananias. We're not literally told, but he's the only one there, so you assume it's Ananias, right? So you assume it's Ananias. He's baptized, filled with the Holy Spirit, which is the point of what was said there in verse 17. And then taking food, he was strengthened after having not had food or drink for 3 days. And now he gets food, along with getting the Holy Spirit, again connecting, using symbolism of actually eating food, and using that symbolically to represent to Saul now, or not yet technically Paul, but now Saul becoming Paul, that again, spiritual food and the filling of the Holy Spirit. You know what I mean? And so the not eating versus the eating is then used to reinforce a point to Saul, just like the whole blindness versus sight thing, of now you have real food. Now you have the real manna from heaven, Christ.
In fact, the analogy on that, I'm going to take it further.
Go for it. Yeah, that's not an exhaustive list, so go for it, yeah.
Saul died. And I'm going to make my
case.
case.
I know where you're going with it. Yeah, sure. Yes,
I'm going to make my case.
Yeah, I'm with you.
In verse 9, we're told, and he was without sight 3 days. 3 days, interesting. 3 days dead.
Correct, yeah.
And he was neither eating nor drinking. Why would the Holy Spirit go an extra furlong to tell us that he was neither eating nor drinking? I'll tell you why.
Dead men don't eat.
Because in all the accounts, I think bar one of resurrection in the Bible,
yes, you are right when you point this.
We're told specifically that when the person was resurrected, they were given food.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
And we're told in verse 19 that he took food.
That's what I was saying. I could already see where you're going with it.
So he's died. He's actually gone through a form of resurrection, a spiritual.
Yes, it's
death
symbolic, yeah.
And spiritual resurrection.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Absolutely. He's been born again. He's been raised from spiritual death. That's what it is. So I'm saying all this stuff is done to symbolically drive home the point. That's what I'm saying about symbolism. Again, symbolism is not unreal. Symbolism doesn't equal untrue. Symbolism is used to convey in a very impactful and overt way that is recognizable and understandable, right? The reality of what's being communicated, right? The being blind, yet bringing sight back. That happened, and it symbolically represented to Saul and to everyone else who he would then tell about it, his spiritual blindness and now his spiritual sight, as well as the fact that it's the Lord that gives the spiritual sight, because the Lord that made him blind, it's the Lord that now makes him see, right? The no food, the 3 days, and the fact that was 3 days, not 2 days, not 4 days, not 4 weeks, 3 days, is done to symbolically represent his death, the fact that he's spiritually dead, and now he's been born again, i.e. resurrected, spiritually resurrected, which is the exact phraseology he uses when he goes and explains the Gospels in his letters, right? All these kind of things, the eating component, about him fasting and being starving spiritually, and now being fed food that strengthens him. When does that happen? He didn't have the Holy Spirit, fasting, not eating, weakened, right? Now he is filled with the Spirit, has food, spiritual strength, spiritual food. All of this is symbolic. It really happened. When we say symbolic, it didn't mean it didn't happen. It means it has symbolic implication. That's what we mean, right? It's symbolic and has real powerful symbolic implication, yes. One final meta point, which rounds up this morning, that concerns the providence of God and his sovereignty. I'll lay it out in like the broad, kind of highlight package. Churches in Jerusalem. Heavy persecution on the part of Saul, by Saul and his team and network under his authority. Causes Church of Jerusalem, all bar the apostles and probably some of the other church Christians there, but the majority of the Church of Jerusalem to disperse and to flee, right? All across Judea, all across Samaria, including up to Damascus. Right, you had Philip going down, Gaza, all the way up along the Philistine city-states, all the way up to Caesarea Maritima, along the coast, right, all around the regions. Saul, that same Saul who persecuted the Church of Jerusalem and caused it to spread, now goes to Damascus upon the intelligence that he would have gained about the church being active in Damascus. On his journey to go and kill Christians in Damascus, Christians who fled from Jerusalem because of his actions, he gets converted and then gets baptized by the church in Damascus, who were only in Damascus because they fled to Damascus from Jerusalem because he was persecuting them in Jerusalem. He caused all the circumstances that led to his eventual conversion. And that is called irony. And God loves irony.
There is no way a human mind could have made this up, this story, this account up. It's too incredible.
The dots that have to connect to bring this to fruition. Yeah, I just don't. And a cost, and not just like one event. This is the course of at least somewhere in the realm of 12 months, probably maybe more by this point, we don't quite know, but it's within 2 years for sure. It's really probably close to a year now. This is a year, maybe even plus, of confluences of events, day in, day out, that go into the very pretext for why he was even going to Damascus had been brought about because of literal months worth of his actions that caused the very circumstances that literally set the stage for this even happening in the first place. All without his knowledge.
God is amazing.
All just God moving pieces around the proverbial earthly chessboard. To line things up where, unbeknownst to him, he is causing, by definition, causing the very circumstances to converge in time and space that would lead to only one outcome. His conversion to Christianity.
How many times do you think he would have meditated upon what you just said over the course of his life? Paul would have...
Oh, like later on? Oh,
yeah, later on.
Everything I'm saying here would have been obvious, and the reason why I know that is because I'm sitting here 2,000 years saying it, and if I can sit here 2,000 years saying it, he, the guy to whom it happened, can very much sit there saying it.
Paul himself would have marvelled at least once, over all these...
He would have marvelled at it when he was writing Romans alone. And the only time that spends on the sovereignty of God, it's not, yeah. And what's incredible is, again, you have to understand, when you understand the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, the providence just being like the practical outworking of God's sovereignty, all of these events happened the way they happened because it was his destiny to eventually one day march on Damascus and end up getting converted to Christianity. That was always going to happen. There was no time in which that was never not going to happen, and that was always going to happen from before he was even born. That was his destiny. That was his destiny. That is the definition of destiny. That's what it is. There was nothing that he was ever going to do that would have somehow outran or changed the course of his destiny. That's what destiny is.
But when you think about his life, how he was educated at a Greek university in Tarsus, he was fluent in Greek, he was a lawyer, he was fluent in Hebrew, he was a Roman citizen.
Exactly. He knew Latin. He would have known Latin.
The amount of coincidences is God written. It's
Correct.
God inspired.
He was born. He was literally born for it.
He was unique.
He was born for it.
In the same way that Moses was educated
Yep.
in the Pharaoh's house.
Yep, all of that. Yep, 100%.
Were in charge and built all the roads.
All of that. Yep.
Alexander did all these conquerings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. All those things, exactly. And that's why, that's why, you should study that history. You should study the history of Alexander. You should study the history of of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Kingdom. It's not just like offer historical tidbits. No, they're prophesied by Daniel. Like he prophesies Alexander in all but name. Man of the North. It's not. It's prophesied. You have like, it's like we take interest in it because the Bible references Alexander the Great 150 years before he comes along. It references Cyrus the Great 150 years before he's born by name. By name, and we're going to, and people have questions as to whether or not this, like, as to prophecy being real, as to God predicting things. Like, he mentions this guy by name and tells you what he's going to do, and then that happens by name, and he does that exact same thing. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out something must be going on here, right? Like, all those confluences of events that occurs, the pretext for how on earth a man like Alexander the Great even gets into his position, right? Because as great as Alexander was by virtue of his epithet, his father was arguably greater, Philip II, who really, I mean, Alexander inherited the most powerful army the world had ever seen at that point. He inherited Macedonian warriors who made the other Greek warriors look like amateurs, and he inherited everything he could have possibly needed to go forth and conquer Babylon, to conquer Persia, to conquer Egypt, to conquer all the way across to India. So all the content, and take the Greek language with him, conquer almost the extents of the world as they knew it, except at least towards the east, and to set up all that confluence of events, and that's just 300 years before Christ, let alone the rest of what has to unfold over the course of then 300 years after that. All these things. The way that the Roman Empire even became an empire required so many things to go right. When you actually study, Julius Caesar and how he ended up getting to the position that he was in, when then his successor, Octavian, as he was then referred to, the one who we now call Augustus, the series of things that could have gone wrong for both of those men to not have ended up in the position where the empire was even born in the first place. I know the empire is the enemy, but the things that had to go right for it then to whittle all the way down to where the point was where the republic collapsed and the empire was born, required such an infinitely long list of things to happen. Where Julius Caesar could have been assassinated way far before he ever was, right? Eventually assassinated. Octavian could have been assassinated a dozen different times and wasn't. All these kind of things have to occur. All the different Game of Thrones that had to take place to be able to then move these things around, and then you eventually reach the point where now Rome is in charge, they're now an empire, they've now conquered the world, and the stage is set.
Built all these roads so they can be travelled.
Yeah.
Yep.
They meant it from the gospel, that God knew he was bringing good.
Correct, yeah. This even just on an isolated level, this is one of the most overt examples of what you intended for evil, God intended for good. That ancient proverb, essentially, which is what it is from Genesis, right? Yeah. It's a proverb, basically. Yeah. That ancient proverb is coming to a really overt demonstration in the story, the life, the conversion of Saul, now Paul.
Where would we be without the New Testament?
Yeah. Where would we be without just him?
Yeah.
The history of the world would look different without just this one individual. Just this one. This is the guy who takes the gospel all around. This is the guy who, before the first century even, before he's barely ended up writing the final epistles of his, the gospel has already reached in the first century. The gospel has already reached Gaul, which is modern day France. The gospel had already reached Hispania, which is modern day Spain. It had gone all around the world. It had gone all around the empire. It had got to Carthage. It had gone all the way across to modern day, what for us today would be modern day Tunisia and Morocco. So the Atlantic end of North Africa, right, which was all Roman territory. Again, Rome had conquered the world as far as they and everyone else was concerned, and it had spread all around the world, even by that point.
Still doing it.
Exactly.
Before I became a Christian, I had read scholars who now I know ignorantly accused Paul of creating Christianity.
Yeah, it's a tired old argument. Yeah, it's
a common one.
It's a common one. It's a go-to argument of Muslim apologists. So the go-to Islamic argument against Christianity is that the Al-Kitab, the book, i.e. the Gospel, that was originally given to the Prophet Jesus. Again, I'm speaking from the Islamic perspective here. To the Prophet Jesus, was then, and to his disciples like Peter and the others, was then altered and changed by Paul, right? And so what we have today was changed and altered from the original. Now, that's the very brief version of the Islamic apologetic claim against Christianity. The problem is that it begs the question. It conducts a logical fallacy called begging the question. Begging the question is where the very presumption of the argument begs the question as to how you know it. So, for example, to make that claim as a Muslim apologist, right, as an evangelist or an apologist on the Islamic side, to make the claim that Paul changed the original message and that Jesus was only really a prophet, that Peter and the other apostles all knew he was only a prophet, and to know that it was changed by Paul, you have to logically know what the original was. Do you understand how that works, right? Like, so if let's just say I have this in English, just what we've read here this morning, and then someone comes along later, and just the English version, forget the Greeks, just pretend the English is the original for a second in this analogy, right? The English is the original, and we've read this morning's passage from 1 through to 19. Someone else comes along later, even in English, and they have a reading of this that's different. I can compare the two because I know what they're presenting later, and then I can look back at the original and see the difference. In order to claim that something's been changed, you have to know what it was changed from. And that's never been done in the history of Islamic apologetics. Does that make sense? No Islamic apologist has ever been able to demonstrate what the Al-Kitab supposedly was originally. They just claim, it was changed by Paul. How do you know that? Well, because originally Jesus was just a prophet. Well, how do you know that? Because the Quran tells us. Yeah, but how do you know the Quran's accurate? Well, but you know what I'm saying? It's all just basically because the Quran says so. But see, we don't do that. We don't have that on our end, right? The reason why we know what the Old Testament said is not because, just because the New Testament says so. No, it's because we have the manuscripts of the Old Testament. We can see what it said, right? We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, like from Isaiah, which go back to 200 BC, right? The earliest manuscript, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is just the most recent and major manuscript discovery. There have been plenty throughout history, obviously. But before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, and all those scrolls, particularly the Hebrew texts, right, the earliest manuscript copy that we had in the church of Isaiah was from 1000 AD. Not BC, AD. 1000 AD, which obviously 1,000 years after the New Testament, and not just that, it's 1,700 years after Isaiah. Long time. And it said, I'm not saying it was a problem necessarily, but it said what it said. We then discover the Dead Sea Scrolls, find therein a scroll of Isaiah, a complete scroll, by the way, of Isaiah, from 200, it's reliably dated to 200 BC, word for word, identical to the copy from 1000 AD, which meant that the copy from 1000 AD had been perfectly sustained, maintained, across a 1,200 year period, word for word, 2 centuries before Christ and the time of the first century. And it is absolutely identical. Go find me literally anything that comes even close to that, and you will die very tired because you will never find it. No. So we know the New Testament says that this is what Isaiah said. No. We have the manuscript evidence that shows us what that text said. So we know understand how it works, right? In order to claim that Paul changed it, you have to know what the original was, which they can't do because this magical original that they claim as it was never happened. That's the problem. Yeah. Are there any specific questions or comments about this morning? Any further questions or comments about this particular subject before we open up to anything else? Good.
Actually, I'm marvelling at chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Acts. I didn't know how dense and how packed with information they were.
Yeah, that's what I've tried to highlight for us. Yeah.
Like I'm just marvelling.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's going to be that way because of the historical element, because of how this is. That's the beauty of historical narrative, is you can get really deep into the linguistics and the history of that particular text, which, again, this is not like it goes in depth, but again, the whole model of Luke is macroscopic, microscopic, right? Zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, zoom in. Zoom in on a specific thing that's theologically relevant, and then zoom back out to cover the details in between. Then zoom back in to a theologically relevant, then zoom back out to the macroscopic. You know what I mean? That's the model that he uses, right?
But that's a very sort of doctor thing, isn't it?
It's a very academic way of doing it. It's a very academic way of doing it, yeah, of focusing on, especially when you're trying to cover decades, which is what this does. Like, ultimately, not holding at this point, but the Acts of the Apostles covers from day one through to essentially the death of Paul, basically. That's what it's covering pretty much.
When I first approached the book of Acts, I approached it as a historical drama, a narrative. 34 chapters of so much information to take in. But in addition to the historical detail that's provided here, I'm just gobsmacked at the amount of theological.
Yeah,
depth.
That's the other big side of it. Yeah, is that nothing is chosen. That's why I mentioned by macroscopic details. Zoom into something. That's what I said just then. Like, zoom into something theologically relevant. Zoom back out to the macroscopic details. Zoom back in to a theologically relevant. So all the different the actual individual. There's a bomb load of stuff that could have been covered. And we're talking about decades of history here. There is like. Well, paying smart, half the time, like my sermons, it's the majority of the time is spent culling things and figuring out what not to mention, not what to mention, because there's so much material. Like, it's not the issue. I don't struggle on a Sunday to figure out what to put in there. The issue is figuring out, oh boy, what do I not put in there? Like, it's, you know what I mean? That's what takes up 90% of the time. Is the same thing would have been happening here. He's thinking, oh, what do I not include? Like, oh, this story, that story, all these different things. So he's carefully crafting what things to zoom in on, whilst still having it flow and being able for then the audience, no matter when they were from, back then, over the last 1,000 years now, to then be able to follow it through the theological kind of weaving of how things are moving on, progressing, developing, all that kind of thing, right?
But he's being led by the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm just talking about on the human level of him sitting down at a desk, figuring out what to put. That's what I mean. It's the interaction between the divine and the human in this process. Is that there's still the human element, which is what's so incredible, right? Is that Paul sounds very different from Mark, who sounds very different from Luke, who sounds very different. All of those sound entirely different to this alien called John, who doesn't write like any of them. He writes a completely unique way. That's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels, from synopsis, meaning they give the same synopsis. They're synoptically similar. They are counting the same details. And then you've got this text from the planet Jupiter called John, which is just this foreign text. It's had nothing, not chronological. It's not even chronologically structured. It's theologically structured. Like John, you don't go to John if you're looking for the chronological ordering of things. It's not even chronologically ordered. Yeah. It's theologically ordered. That's why it's these two are the synoptics. This is the unique one.
I understand that he wrote it after Patmos, so he was
as in his gospel.
Yeah.
No, the evidence pretty strongly suggests that he wrote his epistles and his gospel pre-Patmos. Yeah.
Okay. So what? The letters were written after Patmos.
No, letters were written before. Yeah. The best indication we have is that everything is that the revelation was the last thing that he wrote.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. There was one point, kind of 7th, or 18th, 19th century, when there was when the idea kind of was postulated that maybe the epistles were written after Patmos. He comes back from Patmos. He's released back from Patmos, but no. When you actually dive into some of the primary and secondary source information of some of the early reliable information that we have especially from some of the early church historians, it's all pretty clearly indicating that the gospel or for John, his gospel account and then his 1, 2, 3 epistles were written pre-Patmos. Yeah.
He was still on Patmos when he wrote Revelation.
Oh yeah, that was definitely written on Patmos. Yeah, no, that was entirely on Patmos. Yeah. None of that was written post-Patmos. That was all Patmos.
And he died not long after.
Yeah, he's really old by the time. He actually came back for quite a while.
To Ephesus?
Yes, to Ephesus, yes, which is near Patmos. You know, you would sail from Ephesus to Patmos. And he was in Ephesus. He was cared for there by the church of Ephesus. He's buried in Ephesus. I mean, he can go to his tomb in Ephesus. Yeah. You can go
So
to...
how come his gospel is so different?
Different,
to
yeah.
the others?
I think just quite clearly, in terms of the why would generally, probably the best explanation is the fact that it deals so much with the deeper theological basis of the incarnation of Christ, right?
The first verse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's not the prologue, John's prologue, which is the first 18 verses of that gospel, are, I mean, it's not widely regarded as one of the most theological, not just theologically, but one of the most philosophically dense pieces of ancient literature. I mean, it might as well have been written by Plato, right? It might as well be. It's on that level, right? It's on the level of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, right? It's deeply philosophical, but right. But what the different gospel authors are doing, right? Matthew's very clearly writing to Jews. Mark is very clearly writing to Latins or Romans, and Luke is very clearly writing to Greeks. John combines all three of those. He's writing to the Jew, to the Greek, and to the Roman. Whereas those other three Gospels are clearly writing to specific audiences, Jews, Romans, Greeks, the three big categories relevant to them and to the Christians in the day. John's combining all of those. It's a profoundly theological and philosophical work that is not specifically historical. Obviously, it includes history. It's written historical narrative, but it's far less focused on the historical element. That's why it's not chronological. Like it's not. It's thematically. It's ordered thematically, not chronologically, and so that's why it's so unique in that sense. Is that clearly John was being used to communicate something to a much broader audience than just those three individual Gospels. And that's why it's good that we have three, by the way, well, four total, but you mean in terms of the individual three, the synoptics, it's a good thing we have the three synoptics, because you get the Hebrew flavour, the Roman flavour, the Greek flavour, to use it in inverted commas. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the short explanation. Yeah. Very good. All right. Any other... That essentially ends the study. Obviously, I'm happy to talk about anything else if anyone has any other subjects, but that therein ends. So.
I was going to say,
yeah.
This isn't the first. There's other references to his conversion in Acts as well.
Sure. Yeah.
More times.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
This is the first one.
This is the first, mate. I'm saying this is the where we're getting introduced to Saul, Paul.
Yes. And then there's two.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it comes up, and that's what I'm saying. A number of the details that come up here, and that's why I said a lot of the background, like Saul of Tarsus, like we'll explain that whole background of him later when it comes up in the in the bigger detail, and because this is just the introductory transition. And so obviously the rest of the chapter is then concerned with him as well, at least for the up until about 3/4 of the way through, and so we'll cover that over the coming weeks. So yeah.